didn't hear that, you might check it out online. It is on there and it does work because I looked at it yesterday. Because I think that introductory material would be helpful going forward.
Where is it?
So it's Tusculum.org. If you go to the YouTube channel, there's a list of all there's classes and sermons and everything on there. So mine just says Foundations Class 1. So it's on there.
You can also get to it on Facebook.
Also, this is kind of our plan for study. If anyone did not get a sheet, I have some extras that were left over from last week. I'd be glad to just send me after class. We'll get you some of those. Where to put it now? There we go. Put it right there. So today we're supposed to be doing 2 and 3 today, but we're going to go back and touch on 1 since we didn't get very far into that last week. And so one of the things that we were looking at, does it go back? Yeah. One of the things that we were looking at just in the structure of Genesis is that we have a number of kind of recurring things. This is one part of why Genesis 1 is a lot different from Genesis 2 and 3. The structure of it is much different. And we see a lot of these different recurring things where, and God said, let there be light. There's a fulfillment of whatever he said, let there be, then it was. We see those things occurring over and over. That's very different than what we will see in chapters 2 and 3. So I ask you the question, what does Genesis 1:1 say? And anybody want to answer that?
In the beginning, God created the heaven and the earth.
You're mumbling there. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth, right? That's what we all grew up with. That's what's in probably most translations. But I pointed out, when we looked at that little section of Hebrew on that first slide, there's no commas, periods, exclamation marks, quotation. There's none of that stuff in there. And so it's really up to the translator as to how they break it up. And so traditionally it's been broken up as in the beginning God created the heavens and the earth. That's pretty straightforward. It's just a simple statement. But then we have an issue with that because you read on and the heavens were created on the second day. Well, how can the second day be the beginning? It wasn't the first day of the beginning. So there's a little bit of an issue there. And so, James, to get the bullets to come up, do us touch it or what?
Just slide it.
Oh, slide it again? Look at there.
Progressive slide.
So there's the first one. So there are other translations out there. This is one. I probably can't see it, but these other translations take that first sentence and make it a conditional clause, and it's attached to the second sentence. The third one we'll look at actually takes verse 1 and verse 2 as conditional clauses and attaches them to verse 3. So this one says, when God began to create the heavens and the earth was without form and void, and darkness was upon the face of the deep, and the Spirit of God was moving or hovering over the waters. And then the last one is, when God began to create the heavens and the earth, and when the earth was without form and void, and there was darkness upon the face of the deep, and a mighty wind was blowing over the surface of the waters, then God said, let there be light. I really like that third one because it kind of climaxes with the first event of creation. But all three of these are accurate translations. There's nothing wrong with any one of them. I think Gail had asked the questions where these other ones come from. And the second one are in more modern versions of the Bible. They're not in ESV because that's what I have. And it has the old, in the beginning God created the heaven and the earth. But the New American Standard, the New Revised Standard, the Revised Standard, and the AV, I guess that's the American version. I'm sure it is. Or maybe it's Authorized version. I don't know. But anyhow, those have the second one. And the third one is found more in Jewish Bibles. So like the Jewish Study Bible has this translation where the two clauses connect to verse 3. One other point I did not make last week that I wanted to come back to is this word created that's in there. That is a Hebrew word called bara. And in Hebrew, there are several different words for creating or making something. Here, it's bara, which has the connotation of creating something essentially from that wasn't there before. So when God said, "Let there be light," there wasn't any light before, and then He said, "Let there be light," and now there's light. So that's the concept of bara. Another one that we'll see in chapter 2 is the word yatsar, which yatsar has more the content of meaning of forming something. So if you think of a potter taking a lump of clay and forming it into a piece of pottery, that's yatsar. Okay, and then the third one, which is probably the most common one, is asa. It just means he made, or it can mean did. But I see that one all the time in Hebrew. So you can bara, you can yatsar, you can asa to create, to make things. The interesting thing is that only God can bara. The subject of bara is never anything but God. And really, this is the main point where it's used. It's right here in Genesis 1. Any of us can yatsar things. We can take something that's already made and make something else out of it, right? You can take cookie dough and make cookies. That's yatsari. Or you can just make something asa. But only God can bara. So that's one thing that's kind of unique about this particular passage. And then I think I've got a note here that goes with the next page. Blessing or power. That goes with the Sabbath. Okay, so that's kind of what we see in terms of Genesis 1:1. And then there's all this talk in here, particularly if you have an older version like King James or any of the others that have been around for a while, about the firmament. And what was the firmament? There were waters below the firmament. There were waters above the firmament. So this is just a little pictorial of a black box in the middle of the picture. Does that mean we're dying or what?
On the vine, can you look at us?
This is kind of how the ancient Eastern people, Mediterranean people, would have looked at the structure of the earth. And so we have the earth itself, and then there's the firmament. Originally is kind of what we see as what we call the sky. It's got the moon, the sun, the stars in it. But then there's waters above that firmament as well, and there's another heaven above that. And then you can see there's also an underworld, and there are these pillars that are holding up. So Atlas does not hold up the world. These pillars hold up the world. We figured that out last week. But this is just kind of a pictorial idea of how they thought about the world. And so there's this underworld too. In the Old Testament, you read a lot about going down to Sheol. You know, when you die, that's this underworld down here. That's kind of what they believe, that you went after you died. We kind of think about when we die and we go to heaven, but they went to the underworld first. And then another thing that we see that, again, it's very different in Genesis 1 than Genesis 2, is there's a lot of symmetry in it. And so if we look at the 6 creation days, we have days 1, 2, and 3, where we have light, we have the sky, the seas, and then we have land and vegetation. And what's interesting about this is that there are 2 words that are used here in Hebrew that rhyme. And one of the things we're going to see as we go through this book, there's a lot, and this is just Hebrew in general, they do a lot of word puns. Sometimes it's words that rhyme, sometimes it's words that are similar but have different meanings. Well, there's a really good one that we'll talk about a little bit if we get there, with Adam and Eve and the serpent. But here, the words, where we read in our Bibles that the world was formless and void, those are the Hebrew words. It was bohu and tohu. So, they probably got a kick out of reading that. We kind of miss it in English. But basically, the tohu means like a desert or wasteland place that, basically is worthless. In fact, that word is used some in the Old Testament to describe the worship of idols. It's worthless. There's no value in it at all. So when we see that the world was formless, that's kind of the tohu part. But the bohu part is that it was void. It was empty. Bohu means empty. And so what we see, I think Mark had a slide similar to this in one of his sermons several weeks ago when he started that last series. What we see in Genesis 1 is that there are these characteristics of what the world was like, but then the void part gets filled on days 4, 5, and 6. So first there was light, and then that light is filled with the sun, the moon, and the stars. And they were markers of the light, if you will, after the light was first made. And then on day 2, where there were skies and seas, on day 5, we have birds and sea creatures. And then on day 6, where there's vegetation, we have land animals and ultimately man. So it's just kind of an interesting symmetry. And Hebrews do a lot of this kind of stuff in terms of their writing. So last word I wanted to look at here was where they were told to have dominion over the earth and to subdue it. A lot of times that gets the wrong connotation too. Sometimes we think about subdue as subjecting somebody, putting them under your subjection. And that's not really what this word means. In the original language, it means really bringing order out of disorder. And one thing we'll talk about in a little bit is that this is the creation story in Genesis. There are a lot of creation stories. I don't know if you've ever read, any of the others, but there's a lot of Babylonian, Mesopotamian creation stories, and they are remarkably similar to Genesis. There are a lot of things. Most of them, after so many days, the God that's making whatever rests, just like we see in Genesis. There are a lot of similarities between them, but a lot of those ancient Near Eastern mythology creation stories are about overcoming chaos. There's chaos in the world, and there's creatures that are taking over everything, and so the gods have to overcome them and conquer them. And so this word subdue kind of tells us that God is, in a sense, maybe he's signaling to us that he's in control of the chaos. We don't have to worry about, Leviathan or Rahab or any of the other creatures and whoever that were supposedly part of the chaos that was originally there, because God is in control of all of that. Okay, so here it is. This is one of the accounts, the Enuma Elish. This is from a Assyrian cylinder. Does anybody in here read cuneiform? No? No? Cuneiform. Could somebody read this for me? Okay, well, I can't either, so we're all in the same place.
Too much of it's missing.
Some of it's missing. So this is it's really interesting stuff. And there's a lot of this stuff. I was surprised when I took that course in Mesopotamian history. And there's tons of this stuff that they've dug up in parts of the ancient Near East. But I'll just give you the summary here. This is a Babylonian creation story. According to the Enuma Elish, there were 2 gods, Apsu and Tiamat, who created all the other gods. And one of the gods that they created was Marduk. Marduk actually became like the chief god of the Babylonians. Marduk killed Tiamat, and he used her body to make the heavens and the earth, and he used her blood to make humans. So you can kind of see a vague similarity there between their creation story and what we have in Genesis. But my question for you is, what's the difference in the creation account that we have in Genesis 1 and the Enuma Elish or the Ptah creation story in Egypt or any of these other ancient Mesopotamian creation stories? What's the difference?
One difference is one God.
Okay, there's lots of gods in most of the other, in Babylon, Sumeria, all of these other places, Acadia, multiple gods that are involved in it. Okay, so that's one big difference. Anything else anyone can think of?
Could you say deity?
Okay. Yeah, this is, well, they viewed those gods as deity,
Right.
although we would believe they weren't, right? Because the whole point here is that there is one creator God, and it's the Lord God of Israel. But it's interesting that the gods in Babylonia and in Sumeria and in all these other places were part of the creation. In other words, they weren't outside of it. They were immanent. They were involved in the worlds that were created. And that's that their sphere. They would have battles with other gods and kill the other god and all this kind of stuff. Where the Lord God of Israel, Yahweh, is not within his creation. He is outside. He's transcendent beyond his creation. And therefore has control over everything that goes on in the heavens and in the earth. So that's a huge difference in terms of mythological creation stories and the account that we have in Genesis 1. Here's actually a picture. A CNN crew happened to be there that day and captured Marduk slaying Tiamat. And so that's what this is, Marduk slaying Tiamat in the Babylonian creation story. Okay, any questions on Genesis 1 before we move forward? By the way, I didn't get any emails last week, so I guess it was clear as mud, right? But if you do have questions or if you're reading ahead for next week, feel free to email me. If there's something you want to talk about, richard.thompson@lipscomb.edu, and I'll be happy to try to carve out time for that in the class. Gail?
So if we wanted to have a more accurate Hebrew translation of from Hebrew of this, what should we look for? I mean, is there a Jewish study Bible? Is that what you look for? Or what
well, there are a lot of sources of the Hebrew. I mean,
which translation would be?
Yeah,
yes.
I don't have the Jewish study Bible, but I have a Hebrew Bible at home that's just basically Masoretic text.
I can't read that.
Yeah, well, yeah. An interesting site you might want to look at. I saw my sister about this last week. There's a place called BibleHub.com that's kind of an interlinear, and they will put out the actual Hebrew, and then they'll put the English translation beneath it, and you can actually click on the words, and it'll go into Strong's Concordance and tell you the meaning of individual words. I use that quite a bit in study. It's pretty helpful.
What was that website again?
What's that? It's called BibleHub.com. Yeah. It'll even tell you how to pronounce the Hebrew if you want to get into pronouncing it. It's got a phonetic pronunciation of it. So that can be helpful. Okay, so as we get into Genesis 1, the first thing that we come across is the Shabbat, the seventh day. The heavens and the earth were finished, and all that was in them. I can see the sunglasses. And on the seventh day, God finished his work that he had done, and he rested on the seventh day from all his work that he had done. So God blessed the seventh day and made it holy, because on it God rested from all of his work that he had done. So the Shabbat, I really feel like this is something that we've kind of missed out on a little bit as Christians, you know. And I realize there are some groups out there that are very prominent about holding on to the seventh day and all, but I'm pretty sure that all of the early Christians who were Jews, they didn't quit observing the Shabbat. You know, they didn't just throw the light switch and go, okay, guys, now it's Sunday. You know, we're going to do that instead. But over time, it's kind of morphed into that. And I think the thing that's important here is that the fact that God, I don't think he needed rest. I don't think he was tired from all that he did. The word basically means cessation of activity. I mean, it's not like he was just worn out and had to lie down for a while, but that the work was finished. And so there was cessation of his creation. And the Jews revered this, of course. I mean, and took it to lengths kind of ridiculous at some point about what you could and couldn't do on the Sabbath day. But I do think it's a concept that we've kind of missed out on in our country, in our culture. You know, for most of us, if you work, you know, Saturday's the only day that you can get everything done that needs to be done that you can't do when you're at work, right? That's the way it was for me until I retired. So you tend to be pretty busy. And sometimes Sundays can be worse than Saturday. You come to church, you got life group at night, so on and so on and so on. You can be pretty busy on Sundays too. But if God proclaimed a day of rest, it's probably something to think about that, who are we to think that we don't need a day of rest? And the other thing that's kind of interesting about this is that the Shabbat marks off a week. It was the seventh day, right? So why is a week 7 days? Why do we have weeks that are 7 days? Why are weeks not 9 days? Or 4 days? Who would like a 4-day week? That way weekends would come twice as often, right? Why is a week 7 days?
Because God made it that way.
It's following this pattern, exactly. But what's interesting is that every other measure of time is based on cosmological phenomena, right? So a day is 24 hours. Why?
The sun.
That's how long it takes for the sun to come up and go down and come up again, right? It's 24 hours. A month is 30 days. Why? The moon, exactly. That's how long it takes to go from new moon to, new moon to full moon to new moon, right? 30 days. Year, same thing. I haven't verified this, but I think it takes a year for the constellations to kind of go around and come back to their original positions. Don't quote me on that because I'm not 100% sure that's correct, but certainly it's 12 lunar months, that it takes for that to happen. So all of those other things, days, months, years, are based on cosmological phenomenon that we can see and measure. But there's nothing cosmological about a week being 7 days, right? The only thing is that God rested on the seventh day. So that's really kind of why we have weeks that are 7 days and not 4 days or 9 days. So I think it's kind of interesting.
Do all cultures observe 7 days?
All Jewish and mostly Christian cultures do. Now, that's a really good point you bring up, because back then in the ancient Near East, a lot of the Babylonian cultures had 15-day periods, and they would coincide with the full moon. And so there's some thought that maybe this is kind of to argue against a 15-day week and for a 7-day week, so it doesn't coincide with the full moon. So just kind of an interesting thought. We don't really know that, of course. But I would encourage you, one thing I tried to do when I retired was I tried to really start observing the Shabbat. Seriously. Just not work, don't do anything on that day. And boy, it's really amazing to do that. It's really refreshing. And it's hard to do in our culture just because there's so much stuff we want to get done. But if you can do that, and carve out time to do that, it's a very worthwhile practice. So I'll leave it at that. So there's kind of 3 versions of the Shabbat. We have this Shabbat, which is God's rest. But in the New Testament, we hear about, we'll have rest for our souls. Jesus talked a lot about a lifestyle of rest, if you will. And then finally, in Hebrews, it talks about a Sabbath yet to come, the final Sabbath, the eternal resting place. And so there are really 3 kind of levels of Shabbat, if you will, besides just what we have here in Genesis 1 or 2. Okay, questions about Shabbat? Let's see how we're doing on time. I'd love to get through creation if we can. That's all I'm for. Okay, so I'm not going to read all the text here because I think you all know the story pretty well. But I'm going to point out some things about it. So, in human creation, for one thing, do you remember in the introductory part where we talked about Toledot sections last week? Toledot section is a section of scripture that begins with, and these were the generations of blank. These are the generations of Adam, these are the generations of Noah, these are the generations of Jacob, whomever. There are 10 Toledot sections in the book of Genesis. This is the first one. And what's interesting about this one is that unlike all of the others that are references to people, personal names, this one begins with, these are the generations of the heavens and the earth when they were created. So it's kind of like, this is the family history of the earth, if you will, when he's talking about the creation of man. So that's a little bit different. Another thing that we have on here, what's our efficiency? Down in verse 7, this is where God is making man. He formed man from the dust of the ground. Now, remember our 3 Hebrew words for making something? He didn't bara man. He bara'd everything else. But he didn't bara man. He formed him. He yatsar'd him. And the imagery there is very much that of a potter taking a lump of clay and making some sort of pottery out of it. That's how the Lord God formed man. Very different word that's being used there. And let's see, I've got a bunch of scribbling written on my thing here. Yes, question?
You think he actually structured us? I mean, you know, our body form,
It says he formed us out of the dust of the earth. Okay? And again, we're going to get to another kind of interesting play on words here, is that he named the human Adam. Now, I know you thought his name was Adam, but it's not Adam, okay? It's Adam. In Hebrew, almost always the accent's on the last syllable, unless it's specified otherwise. So it's Adam.
He speaks of the first Adam and the second Adam. And
Yeah, right, in the New Testament, correct. Kind of comparing Adam and Jesus. But he made Adam from the Adamah. The Adamah is the ground, the dirt, the dust. So you catch the play there? His creature that he makes, he names Adam after the Adamah. It's almost like today we would say that God made man from the dust of the earth and he called him Dusty. It's the same kind of play on words that we find in Genesis 1.
Richard?
Yeah.
What is the word in 127 where he created man?
In 127.
Yeah. So God created man in his own image. I have to look it up. I'll get back with you next week. I expect it, Shatzar, but I'll go back and look at it to make sure. It could be Barah there. I'm glad you pointed that out, though, because that's also where it says, in the image of God, he created him. Male and female, he created them. So that was another question I was going to raise was, what does it mean to be made in the image of God? He made us in the image of God. So you heard the Latin imago Dei? That's where that comes from, the image of God. Oh, no, don't tell me. It's 5 minutes. I'm not going to get very far over it. What does it mean to be made in the image of God? Does it mean we look like him? His characteristics.
Okay, maybe our characteristics are similar to his. Maybe as spiritual beings, and he's a spiritual being. Maybe even the emotions that we have. You know, God has emotions. We see references to that in the New Testament. So there's a lot of things I think that go into that. I didn't make a slide because you could put a whole laundry list of reasons why we are made in the image of God. And we don't know exactly what he was referring to here, but clearly there's a lot of things that we could probably pull into that bucket.
I think too, man, as opposed to the other creatures, has the ability to create music, art, structures. So God gave that as a quality, definitely, that sets man apart from other creatures.
Just the ability to love. Do animals love each other?
Maybe.
Not much, but we do, right?
But
biggest thing he gave us is a soul.
Yeah, the
Yeah.
soul.
Yeah.
But
Because
Well,
animals supposedly do not have one, and that makes us so different
Yeah.
from.
great segue, because the next two terms we're going to look at were nefesh she'ah. Whoops, let me go back. He made us a nefesh she'ah, which is translated usually as a living being. Now, nefesh typically in the Old Testament is translated as soul. But when you think about that, don't think about some little spot inside. You know, we have a body, and then somewhere in there, there's a soul, right? And when we die, the body stays behind, but the soul goes to heaven. That wasn't how they looked at it at all. They looked at the soul as the entirety of the person, body and soul. So when you went to Sheol, all of you went, not just your little piece of soul, but your whole body went in the Jewish way of thinking. But this is a very important point, that he made us a living being, nefesh she'ah. And that is another difference. Okay, I really wanted to get to the Garden of Eden, but I suppose we shall stop there because it is just about 11:15. And boy, we didn't get very far at all, did we? We may not be doing Joseph in this class. I don't think we'll ever get to Joseph. He's like the last 15 chapters or so. So anyhow, we'll stop there. We'll pick up with the Garden of Eden next week. And we're supposed to be doing 4 through 8 next week, which is like Cain and Abel and Babel and all the other things there. So if you want to read ahead for 4 and 8, that would be helpful probably if we get that far. It's hard to do this in 45 minutes, let me tell you. But any other questions about what we've been through so far in Genesis 1? I think the real key here is that, you know, what Moses or the priest, or, you know, if you believe the Yahwist, if you believe Wellhausen's theories about the different writers, what they're trying to tell us is that there is one Creator who is responsible for everything that we experience, heaven and earth. And that's very different than Mesopotamia, Sumeria, Babylonia, all of those places where they had all these multiple gods warring against each other, killing each other, doing all this stuff. Very, very different way of thinking about the Lord God of Israel, Yahweh. So I think that's kind of the main point that we get out of Genesis 1. Okay? All right, no questions?
How do we get a bigger classroom?
I can talk to Dennis if you'd like. I don't know. Was it just Brett and Sarah that weren't able to get in? Was there any
There
others?
was there was another couple too.
Pomeroy's in
Yeah.
All right, I'll talk to Dennis. He asked me last week, and I said, well, they were pretty full. I didn't see any seats, but so we'll see if we can maybe move somewhere else, if that's what you want to do. Yes, ma'am.
It'd be fabulous if that could be made really big on the wall. Your screen up there
Yeah,
could be
it's
made
too
even
little.
bigger.
Oh,
If you're
yeah.
asking for a wish list, that's something.
Yeah.
I'll task George with it.
Your audiovisual crew is aware.
I'll task
We've already discussed it.
Yeah.
I'll task James.
If we moved to the chapel, we could have a bigger street.
Right. Exactly.
All right, we'll try to read through chapter 8 if you can for next week.
People
And
should
we're
know that
particularly
this
focused
class
on
is probably
the rest of 2 and 3 because that's probably the Garden of Eden is